Okay, so we've got a great number and we are at 2:01, so we'll get started. So, hi everyone, my name is Marshall Kosloff. I am the host of the Realignment podcast. I cover a bunch of different issues, but I'm particularly interested in state capacity and infrastructure policy challenges. Specifically, I'm joined by Zach Liscow of Yale University, Yale Law School specifically, who's written a really great paper that we're going to discuss today. I'm also joined by Jen Pahlka of the Niskanen Center, who has written a lot about the state capacity category and has also written a very excellent book, which is somewhere behind me here, but it cannot be located quite at this moment. We'll do book sales later after the event. But as we kick off, how about the two of you just like introduce yourselves to audience members who might not be aware of your work? Zach, we'll kick it to you first.
Yeah. Hi. Like Marshall said, I'm a professor at Yale Law School. I work on two areas. The first is how to tax the rich, which is not the subject of our discussion today, although you can't tax the rich, you're not going to have much state capacity. And the second is how to build infrastructure. I'm motivated by very high costs and very slow speeds of building in the US. The fact that we have these problems means that we have lots of problems with efficiency and equity and making the green transition. So I've been working on trying to how to make these things better.
How about you, Jen?
Hi, Jennifer Pahlka. As Marshall said, I'm with the Niskanen Center and the Federation of American Scientists. I wrote a book called Recoding America, which I guess I'll have to send you another copy so it can be right behind your head. It's got a nice teal color. We should be able to see it. That never mentions the word state capacity, but when folks read it, they just said it was about state capacity, and I decided that was true. But it's really about my observations of mine over 10 years of working in sort of digital government transformation, essentially, which I believe is no longer about digital so much as it is the ability of government to achieve its policy goals. So I had those insights really from working both in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in 2013, 2014, helping stand up the United States Digital Service and running a nonprofit that I founded called Code for America for 10 years.
And Jen, just to follow up on you for a second, can you just define state capacity as a sort of category of policy for folks, and then we could delve into the specifics of the infrastructure application?
Sure. I mean, I would say it's sort of the how of policy rather than the various whats that you might that you might be targeting. I actually had to laugh because, of course, I picked up this term not as an academic, and then when I read a paper about like Sachs, he's actually referencing the academic definitions of it over the years. But the one that I use, and I think is also almost verbatim in the paper, is simply the ability of government to achieve its policy goals. It is often confused with working at the state level in the US. And of course, Zach's paper is a lot about the state level because a lot of infrastructure is built by states. But it really speaks to any level of government in the US. And when I first heard the term, I thought of it as something that international development and international aid people talked about, because the idea was that other countries had low state capacity, and that was something we needed to look out for. And I think it's really been over the past decade that we've realized that the US also has state capacity issues. Our definition of it at the Niskanen Center, just because we have our own paper coming out, very different but very aligned with Zach's, is that in this particular moment, if you want to improve state capacity, you really have to do four things. You have to be able to hire the right people and fire the wrong ones. You have to reduce procedural bloat, both things Zach is talking about. You've got to invest in digital and data infrastructure, and you need to be able to close the loop between policy and implementation. So I think our thinking is extremely aligned with Zach's. He's just going to talk about it in an incredibly specific, concrete way that really brings it to life.
And one note before we continue the questions, we're going to have audience members submit their questions in the chat. And at a certain point, I'll start like highlighting and bring those up to Zach and Jen. So folks should please submit any questions they have as this conversation goes on. So one quick last like sort of definitional question that Zach, I'm really interested to hear from you on. So as you said in your introduction, like your kind of focuses are like taxing the rich, and then like this sort of state capacity question. And I think that what's kind of happened over the past few months is the state capacity questions become very centrist tagged. The type of people who think of state capacity are very much not in the category of people I would think of as defining themselves as like tax the rich people. So can you talk about, and Jen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too as well. Can you sort of talk about where we are at this state capacity, broader economic policy discourse right now?
Yeah. So I work in these two areas, and I really liked working in an area that is centrist. So look, I'm an economist. I'm doing economic work, but I'm also a lawyer doing some legal work on how to tax the rich, which has this, very, very, very politicized valence. And, the people I work with agree with me, but like a lot of the public, especially a lot of politicians, don't. And state capacity is just not that way at all. Of course, there are some folks maybe want to blow up the state and destroy state capacity, but across broad swaths of the public and broad swaths of elected leaders, we want government to work well. And, folks might differ some in the specifics of what you do to increase state capacity, but there's broad alignment on the goal. And I think I'm increasingly seeing broad alignment on the things you need to do to achieve the goal as well. So I think that gives me some hope.
Great. So let's actually get into the specifics of the paper itself. So apply the state capacity frame to how you would define America's infrastructure challenge today.
Yeah. So I started working on this area many, many years ago when I was living in California. And California high-speed rail was not going well. So it's in 2011. Started thinking about it, and California high-speed rail has gone, gotten worse and worse and worse with time. I started thinking about it even more when I was the chief economist at the White House Office of Management and Budget, 2022 and 2023, and saw just the tremendous extent to which the things that Jen talked about, I put them into three categories: personnel, procedures, and tools had a huge impact on what we were able to get done. So state capacity matters a huge amount for infrastructure because the government is involved at kind of from the beginning to the end. So let's take the case of transportation infrastructure. So for a transportation project, you need to decide what to build. You need to plan it out initially, and have high-level thoughts. The government does. Then it needs to be permitted, which means that it needs to go through environmental review. You need to make sure you've kind of thought through all the potential impacts and documented that. Then there's often litigation, but then the government bureaucrats come back in, and you need to come up with the specific designs for the project. Sometimes that's done partly through contractors, but the government needs to oversee them. Then you need to put it out to bid. The government needs to write the bid. Then you get a private contractor to build it, basically universally. And then you need to oversee the private contractor, need to make sure that they're doing the right things. Sometimes you need to renegotiate. And then finally, you open it. But at each step of the process, you need government actors. And all parts of that are just fundamentally not outsourceable. You need, to some extent they are, but you need a decent number of people within government who are high quality. You need enough of them, and you need them, if you want to do it quickly and a reasonable speed and reasonable cost, you need them to have few enough procedures that it doesn't require, a zillion people and a lot of years to get it done. And finally, you need them to have the right tools. You need them to know how much previous similar projects have cost. And often and far too often, we're lacking in all three of these. We don't have enough personnel. We don't pay them enough, so it's hard to attract the right people. They're far too burdened with procedures, from procuring materials to the contracting with contractors to the permitting. And then for tools, they often don't have enough data infrastructure. We often don't have enough planning. to even know where we need to do what. So you add all this together, I think it's one of the primary reasons that the US has such high costs and such slow timelines. I guess a final thing, I guess there's some folks who may not know what those costs actually are. If you look at urban transit in the US is about 2.5 times the average OECD country, or 6 times per mile. Other countries like Spain and Portugal, South Korea. So you can imagine if we get like 6 times as much per dollar, we would be able to accomplish so much more for the American people. So it's really worth trying to figure out how to spend these, tens, hundreds of billions of dollars better to get more bang for the buck.
And Jen, as the co-panelist here, I know you've read the paper. I'd just love to hear like your sort of initial reaction and perspective on this topic, like working as a state capacity person, but also engaging with Zach's work.
I feel like I wish we had like 7,000 people on this webinar, because if people understood the real impact that he's talking about, I think we would have a much more political will for the kinds of changes that Zach is outlining. I'll give you one example that I think needs to be in big bold letters everywhere. Zach, you have a stat that says that on the personnel side, that for states, when you compare states and their staffing and sort of a department, I think it was Department of Transportation, that just one additional staff member per 1,000 population reduces the costs of building highways by 26%. I think if I understood that as a taxpayer, I would have so much more support for staffing that Department of Transportation appropriately. And this is just not part of the discourse in the way that it needs to be. Instead, we have this discourse that's extremely hostile to government employees as costs, and a lack of perspective there. The cost of that one employee is like nothing compared to the costs of actually building the highway. And the reason I thought that the paper just felt like it was so aligned with the work we've been doing and the sort of the message that we're trying to get out is, I spent many years in sort of the digital government world, and you have the exact same dynamic there. There's, maybe 3 or 4 people trying to get a contract out to a vendor. Zach, you actually mentioned healthcare.gov in your paper. I was around for that. If you note my years in the White House, 2013 was when that happened. But I have seen that happen so many more times since then, where you don't have the internal competency and capability that you need, and you're incredibly penny wise and pound foolish by saying, let's have this really small team. Not only is it too small, it actually doesn't have the competencies you need. And I'll return to that in a second. And because you're penny wise there, you spend something like, I think healthcare.gov was $60 million, and then it failed and went up to 600 million or something like that, right? These are just not even the same order of magnitude. Why are we, being cheap here when it's going to cost us so much there? And I think this is also relevant to the paper. You have contracting professionals sometimes, they're overstretched. But what you also are really stretched on is the expertise in the actual domain. So in my world, it was like, there are people around who know how to make a contract. There are not people around, or far too few people who actually know how a website is built, right? We need the engineers, we need the designers, they need to have that perspective, not because they're not going to outsource the building of it, they are, but because you have to be good at the thing in order to buy those services well. And I think it's got to be so much more part of our dialogue, as especially we move into this sort of chaotic era where there's this discussion of cutting government waste is front and center every day.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, like, listen, obviously there are people who are doing a bad job in the federal government and in state governments and in private companies and in lots of places. And in those are wasteful people. But like the idea that like each government employee, like if we just cut them would be better off is a pretty silly one. And in the case of infrastructure, it's, since you're spending so much money, and because the employees cost such a small amount relative to the cost of these, $1 billion, $10 billion projects sometimes, it's really easy to see how if you bring in more people who have more competency, you can do a better job planning it, you can do a better job implementing it, and for each extra person there, you can actually save money. So this was well illustrated in the California high-speed rail example, actually. Talk about that some in the paper. So this is based on California high-speed rail's own audits. What they did was they said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to build this gigantic, originally $20 billion to $25 billion project. What we're going to do is we're going to create a whole new agency to do it. So it's like, we're going to invade Iraq, and we're going to start by creating a whole new army rather than using like the existing army that's already there. So what happened, there was very few people working there. They didn't have much capacity. Everything was outsourced, the planning. We ended up with the consultants were running things so much that the folks in the California High-Speed Rail Authority were often reporting to the outside contractors. And if you don't have like a principal, like the main actor, who kind of knows what it wants, it's going to be really, really hard to get where you want to go, because contractors, like, they don't have a goal. Their only goal is, they don't have an ultimate goal. The only goal is kind of doing what you want. If you don't even know what you want, what are they going to do? One, they're not going to do what you want since you don't know what you want. Two, probably they're going to have an incentive to spend more money because they're profit-making enterprises, and more hours, bigger project will tend to mean that they're going to spend more money. Now, look, don't want to trash outside contractors totally. We need them. Like New York City does not have deep expertise in building tunnels deep underground for, say, for this new Second Avenue subway. So you need to have them, but you need to manage them well. If you don't have enough people, you're not going to do a good job of that. In this story that I talked about, that Jen talked about, and that I talked about with California High-Speed Rail, you just see over and over again. You see it in New York City, Second Avenue subway. You see it in the Boston Green Line, another example that I talk about. They have this multi-billion-dollar expansion of the Green Line from Boston to Cambridge. They have like 4 or 6 people managing it, and that's a real recipe for failure.
I think one of the things that this speaks to, if I may, is that state capacity is fundamentally about caring about the implementation of our laws and policies. And we so often think, okay, money has been designated to do this, like with California High-Speed Rail. That's the important part. That was the political fight. Now other people will go just make this happen. And when Zach talks about like not having an empowered leader there who can make stuff happen, that is such a consistent pattern. And I think it's a core dysfunction of just our political culture. And I think, frankly, our American culture, right? That we're giving all of the attention to the decision to do it and none of the, so little attention and little power, right? To the people who are actually supposed to then make that real. Why is it surprising to us that something like California High-Speed Rail failed, or healthcare.gov, or the FAFSA this year, when that is not what we value? And I think Zach and I have a very, very aligned set of prescriptions that are sort of, concrete and you could do to fix these things. But there's something underlying all that, which is that the American public and our political culture has to start thinking differently about what's important and put somebody with sufficient power and leadership ability in the role of making that happen, making the rail happen.
Something I'm curious about, Zach, because it seems like there's a bit of a chicken or the egg. Chicken or the egg isn't quite the proper metaphor here, but if we look at the California high-speed rail debacle, it seems to be the canonical just example that everyone across the ideological spectrum could highlight as something correct. When we see these projects not work over a almost 20-year plus timeline, that then creates a lack of faith in government, that government can't even do these things in the first place, which then leads to both cynical and then uncynical sort of takes on these things. So not to Monday morning quarterback it, but as people are thinking about the possibilities of our time, I think there's a world where we simply say, hey, until we solve state capacity, or at least get to certain benchmarks, we shouldn't even have done this project in the first place. So like let's not just throw up these like boondoggles as things that ideological opponents of government will just use against it. So how do you think of that dynamic when it comes to sort of, do we keep doing big things? Do we solve things? I think another example would also be like the EV battery charging systems over the past few years. Like now for the rest, I'd say for the next decade or so at a minimum, any opponent of like federal infrastructure spending, and frankly, any opponent of the EV charging ecosystem will use the 7 or 8 constructed as an example why this shouldn't be done. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, I think not building any big infrastructure I view as is not a feasible option. Like how much less is kind of a question for debate. But listen, to make the green transition, we're going to have to build lots of long distance transmission from where the energy is produced to where it is consumed. And those are big, of the kind that I've just been describing, big long distance. We built 0 over the last decade. That's not a personnel issue. That's more of a procedural, too many procedures issue, as well as maybe not enough centralization of the federal government. It's a federalism issue. Too many government entities deciding, too many procedures that each of them have to jump through. In any case, we need to build it if we're going to make the green transition, which I view as something that we must do. So I don't think we can give in across the board. In some cases, we're going to have to, I don't have a strong view of what it's going to depend upon the individual costs and benefits in the particular case. In terms of how to get better at it, one is support the Niskanen Center, which I think is doing the best work in this incredibly important area. I'm not a big cultural thinker. I'm an economist and a lawyer. I don't think in cultural terms, but I have had a chance to reflect some on how we got to where we are. And my conclusion is that part of the problem is me. So and people like me. So I've long taught an economic and tax policy class at Yale Law School. And in terms of what we want to do part that Jen was talking about that she says we focus on, where's the implementation part that she says we don't focus on but should. I was 100% in the what do we do part and 0 in the implementation part. And this might be particularly striking because I teach at a law school where these are people who are actually relatively good at implementation, like the laws of how we actually deal with these procedures. So my students don't know this yet, but I'm changing the class, and we're gonna talk about what we should do at a high level, but we're also going to talk about implementation. So I don't know why people like me don't talk about implementation. I have some guesses, like PhDs in economics, like we learn the how, we learn the what, we don't learn the how. Implementation stuff is like, it is hard. Like it's very nuanced. Like you can talk at a high level about state capacity, but like to solve it in the context of infrastructure, a lot of the solutions are going to be specific to infrastructure. Not all are. Like Jen's discussion about data infrastructure is actually probably true across a whole bunch. It's true across a whole bunch of things. But in terms of environmental review, which is a big issue for infrastructure, that's specific to building stuff, and it actually doesn't matter outside of building stuff. So maybe it's just hard, but maybe it's just a cultural change, and I'll do my small bit in the spring, since I've been so influenced by what I saw in government and Jen's book and the work that Niskanen is doing. I think that they're really heading in the right direction.
I'm so glad to hear you're changing the course.
See how it goes.
I think
I'll just add, I
Yeah,
do
sorry,
think
please, Jen.
every domain is different, but they do all have these same dynamics, right? Like the personnel, the procedure, and the tools. And it's one thing to say that the implementation is difficult. It's another thing to say it doesn't have to be as difficult. That's the procedural bloat part. It feels a bit like neglect, right? Like it just feels like you walked into a room where like stuff has been left around for years and just, layered on top of each other instead of something that's been really taken care of and nurtured and sort of, I talk about weeding a garden. And so it is unfortunate that like there is no silver bullet for any of this stuff, but the prescription of sort of like diet and exercise, like go clean the room, go weed the garden, is essentially the same, I think, no matter whatever domain you're working in.
And Jen, I'd actually really like to get your thoughts on the political culture question or issue of it Zach raised, because personally, as I focus on this area, a lot of my podcasting work is either in the public policy space or it's in the tech space. And I've just noticed that if we like look at Zach's paper, we'll basically say 1.4 to 1.6 trillion dollars were spent on infrastructure. And at a cultural political level, if you are touting that success legislatively, you'll just treat that number as the success, but not the actual accomplishment. It's like if we were raising for a company and I said, I've raised a $50 million Series A, and not actually focus on what you're actually doing with that money and then touting that success as the actual thing. So that's the sort of like culture difference I've noticed between the two coasts. But what's your take on this political culture gap?
I mean, it's out of my area of professional expertise for sure. But it does feel like it's starting to change. The election feels like a bit of a rebuke of sort of lack of delivery in some ways. I mean, you're the host of a podcast called The Realignment. I feel like we're in a massive realignment where the things that people care about on a practical basis don't line up the way with political views the way that they used to at all. I mean, so you started out talking about the political valence of state capacity, and uh, I came from I'm a Democrat. I came from working in California. We did a lot of social justice issue work, though it was always state capacity work. Um, and when you're in a political bubble, you're told that the right doesn't care about this at all. And I think once my book came out and I got to meet a lot of folks who are working on these issues from the right, I realized that that was simply not true, and that the beliefs that people have held about Republicans wanting to drown government in a bathtub are actually, there's some truth there, but it's generally quite outdated, and that you should really think about the realignment going forward, not sort of what being held to the past, because things are changing very quickly.
And I'm glad you raised that, because the question for you, Zach, would be when it comes to these state capacity challenges, and to what degree are we moving on from sort of 20th century drown, government in the bathtub? Like there is a tension here with Doge, with Elon Musk. So it's kind of funny because you have Elon and then you have Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek's been on the podcast. And sometimes you'll find funny examples on Twitter where like Elon will actually have like a useful quote tweet of some like actual unironic government inefficiency. But if you then look at some of the things like Vivek's talking about, they very much are like more traditional libertarian. I'm just opposed to the existence of like the 20th century post New Deal state. So how do you think about, and you're also seeing with Democratic elected officials, Bernie's going through this, Ro Khanna's going through this, really struggling with how they think about the government efficiency part of DOGE rather than the cost cutting part. How do you advise politicians across the aisle think about this like really interesting political dynamic that could have a good faith version and frankly a bad faith version?
Yeah, I think Doge is might end up being a big irony, which is that great intentions. Like, who doesn't want more government efficiency? I think there's a big risk that they're going to have be counterproductive. The reason being where we began this half an hour ago, which is so much of what they're focusing on is hacking away at the federal workforce. But like, look, the federal workforce has barely grown since the 1960s. As we've been doing more and more and more and more and more. And including, by the way, in ways that like they're not talking about building much less transportation infrastructure. They're not talking about like securing the border less. They're not talking about like having less security in airports. Like they're not actually talking about doing less. Like we need those people. If anything, we probably need more people to do a more effective job. At the same time, the procedural bloat that Jen's talking about is a real thing. So look, best case with this thing, they mostly keep hands off the federal bureaucracy, which in many ways is very good. The people I worked with at the Office of Management and Budget are kind of top-notch people. Like anyone in the world would be lucky to work with the vast majority of them, but deal with some of the bloat. And so I talk about in the case of infrastructure, permitting, there's increasingly a bipartisan, I wouldn't call it consensus, but there's increasingly a bipartisan view shared across many folks that to build the infrastructure that we need, to build the transit that we need, to build the electrical infrastructure that we need significant changes to permitting so that it doesn't take 4.5 years to go through an environmental impact review for every single major project with federal funding, which doesn't even include the part where you plan it beforehand, doesn't even include the part where you litigate it afterwards, doesn't even include the part where you actually develop the specific plans, it doesn't even include the part where you actually build it. It's just 4.5 years of kind of review. And it's notable that these environmental reviews, like the length of these things has increased, the page length has increased over 4 times since the late 1970s. So just to give one example of the kind of things that it's really worth thinking about, I think that there's a lot of potential improvements, and I hope that they are able to make some of them without throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
We talk about the procedural bloat and the personnel separately, but you have procedural bloat in getting your personnel as well. So I'm going to pull another favorite of my stats from Zach's paper, which is that the Greater Cleveland Regional Transit Authority's hiring process recently had 86 steps and averaged 5 months. I'm sure it was like, they always say 5 months, but it's really like it's 5 months for that middle part, not counting the front end and not counting the onboarding and all that stuff. And of course, it leaves applicants that way. So that's procedural bloat too. And to bring it back to sort of, what might or might not be an opportunity to influence DOGE, we need to tweet that out and then get Alex Stapp to tweet that out, because then Elon will retweet it with the words, "This is insane," which is what he did about a stat I said about federal hiring. So we just need to get these things out there to get more attention to them, but also particularly to see if we can influence how this dialogue is going to go now that everyone's talking about government efficiency.
Yeah, far too often.
And just a quick note for the listeners, we've got like 8 more minutes and then we'll get into Q&A. We've got some great questions so far, but be sure to add your questions to the Q&A portion. Thank you, Zachary Norris, for perfectly timing your additional question. But sorry, Zach, back to you.
It is just far too often that folks are just willing to take the status quo procedures and personnel as given. Like the way that you proceed is you just assume like, yeah, we're understaffed and yeah, we have all these procedures to go through. Shucks, we just gotta do the best that we can with what we've got. And I've heard this a lot. And like, I think that's the wrong approach. Like, if you are government if you're if you're a civil servant and like you can't change the policy, then maybe that's right. But like, as policy people on the outside and as the public, like, no, we need to think like, how do we change the system? The problem is the system, and there's systemic problems. So the key thing to figure out is not how to optimize within the system. The key thing is to change the system.
And something I'd love for you to clarify. Obviously, the sort of news hook within the paper is really the fact that, trillions of dollars have been spent post 2021 on these big infrastructure bills. But a lot of the examples we're discussing are state and local ones. So, Jen, you made this reference at the start during your introduction. Obviously, there's like state level state capacity and there's federal state capacity. Where does all of this basically sort out into? So, Zach, you go first, but I'd love to get your take on it too as well, Jen.
Yeah. So in terms of like the federal versus state.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, part of the motivation for all this is the $1.6 trillion of additional spending and the big Biden bills. A lot of this still ends up being spent by the states. So transportation infrastructure is often where it's easiest to see, but it's the same thing with electrical infrastructure, very, very little of which is built or even all that regulated by the federal government, or at least primarily regulated by the federal government. So the federal government spends lots of money, but then it often provides it to the states. So like there's an important federal overlay for the $25 billion a year or so of grants that the Department of Transportation provides to states. Like you need really, really good people at the federal DOT to decide who gets it, but then the local governments get it, and then they're the ones doing a lot of the implementation. So this is maybe one piece of the state capacity issue that focus a lot on the federal government. But when it comes to state capacity, when it comes to, the rubber hitting the road or just the road itself, it's the overwhelming number of people who are, the engineers who are doing the permitting are at the state and local level. So I track this for like civil engineers. Increasingly these people are privatized, which could have problems the way we've been describing, but there are vastly, vastly more, few times as many at the state and local level versus at the federal level. So it's really important to focus on those as well. Just one final point, we've been talking a lot about personnel, but again, I want to talk about the procedures. One part of the problem that we often have is that there are sometimes some multiple layers of rules. There's the federal government rules, and then the state government rules. This happens sometimes with permitting. So sometimes they're just, the rules are duplicative. And if you look at taking a step back from the perspective of federalism, it's too often the case that we have either too much or too little centralization. So let me give you an example of each and then hand it over to Jen. So when it comes to planning transmission lines, we have way too little centralization. What we currently have now is that state and local governments can often each veto a line that needs to go across a bunch of states and many, many different jurisdictions. This is bonkers. If we ever want to make the green transition, these decisions need to be centralized at the federal level, or else we're never going to be able to build these transmission lines. And it's exacerbated by the fact that these local utilities often have really perverse incentives. They don't want to bring in cheap electricity because it would hurt their profits. So this stuff really needs to be centralized. There's not enough centralization in this area. Other times, way too much centralization. So let me give you an example of a railroad bridge in Connecticut. Costs about $1 billion to build. It's on the Metro North line. It's a 100-year-old bridge, needs to be rebuilt because it's old. It is being rebuilt as a bridge that goes up and down, movable. Why is it being rebuilt as a movable bridge, which costs a couple $100 million more to build this way, and then hundreds of millions of dollars more to build in the future? It is being built that way because my sources tell me there's one boat that goes out once a year and comes in once a year and needs to be opened for that. So we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars for one boat. Why is that? There's a rule, the Army Corps of Engineers says that it is implementing, that says it needs to stay navigable. And so here's an area where look, we can trust Connecticut DOT to figure out what to do with the boat. And here, federal government intervention doesn't matter much. So we have a complex federalist system that's not ever going to fully go away, but we have really, really a lot of improvement to make in making the pieces fit together better.
Yeah, it's hilarious. That's another too many requirements. Federalism we sort of are getting the worst of both parts of federalism in some ways these days. It's obviously, there's a lot of trade-offs there, and we seem to be applying exactly wrongly. But federalism just sort of serves as another way to have what we call this cascade of rigidity or a cascade of proceduralism. Like the more steps down, the more you will get locked into wrong designs, too many procedures, too little flexibility, et cetera. And I mean, like everything in federalism, there's a plus and a minus there because you have a lot of different opportunities to go try to find things that fix that. So state state capacity and federal capacity and local state capacity are all intertwined because of our federalist system. But I think to pull out just one thing that I think actually does work here, and we're starting to see it, is a very basic tactic from the creation of digital services from, the tech world. It's just user research, right? So if you go talk to somebody in, say, LA County, I've done this, who had to, deal with all the CARES Act funding, they can tell you all the ways in which that money was prescribed to states and municipalities in ways that made it far less effective and more burdensome to administer. We just don't go talk to those people. We don't do the user research to say, okay, let me sit next to you while you're trying to administer that. We're trying to fill out this form to apply for this grant, where you're trying to do the really complex grant reporting to multiple different entities with different asks and actually understand the burdens you're imposing. Because you talk to somebody who is imposing those burdens, they don't think they're doing it. They think they're doing the right thing and making the right trade-off because they don't actually see the way it is operationalized at the lower levels of government. I want to give big shout out, and this is like a slightly different thing. Well, no, you actually mentioned Paperwork Reduction Act in the paper, don't you, Zach? I think. So recently you had the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs actually do user research with the people that were going to be the subject of guidance that came out. And without going into a long story about it, what always happens when they put out the guidance is that the people who are the subject of that guidance interpret it very differently than they thought, than OIRA intended. And because they did fantastic user research, what's happening is that people are getting this guidance and going, oh, I understand what you mean. You actually want us to be able to do this user research. We are now like actually going to do the thing you said. And it's just because they did a couple of sessions with people to ask them, when we say this, what do you hear? We could be doing that so much more. And I think that's just one of those like healthy, eat your vegetables kind of way that we can reduce procedural bloat, because nobody in government wants to create procedural bloat. They just don't see that they're doing it.
So now we are going to transition to the Q&A section. Lots of great questions. I'll just read them real quick. This is from Chandler. How can Republicans be convinced to support growing state capacity when the incentives in the modern GOP are to grind government to a halt? Either of you could take that question first.
That's kind of a good one for you too, Marshall.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick because actually I have thoughts on this. So like this is actually less of an answer and a frustration noticed. So Jen, like you, I've had a bunch of people who are traditional Republicans and conservatives like reach out saying they're interested in state capacity. The problem is they tend to be people who either work in defense or they work in science and technology policy areas where in their own like lived experiences, quote unquote, like just the state capacity framework is just like very responsive. But I have just noticed there's been some difficulty of like articulating this to like more traditional conservatives who are just thinking through once again that traditional question of, well, look, sure, the California high-speed rail thing could be made more efficient, but actually I just sort of beef with that in general. What's like kind of the big question here? So I think it's like very important that we find ways to articulate, and frankly, that's probably why leaning into like the science, technology, and defense-minded folks first is that part of the coalition who are most interested. But that's sort of like my suggestion.
I completely agree with that, but I also see if you take the state capacity label off the top and you just said, we care about a merit-based hiring system, being able to get rid of poor performers. We care about being competitive. We care about reducing procedural bloat. We care about having digital and data infrastructure, and we care about closing the loop between policy and implementation, which means like more power to Congress to make sure that what Congress says is actually what happens. That actually sounds pretty appealing in a lot of ways, I think, to the right. The label state capacity, yes, I think can turn them off.
I got nothing to add. I spend a lot of time with a lot of Democrats in my academic job and in government, and I have nothing to add to how to your insights on how to deal with Republicans.
So next question from Emily. I know in the city I live in, salaries for public sector transportation engineers are much, much lower than in the private sector, leading to younger or lower skilled city staff. Likely this pattern repeats itself at all levels of government. Any ideas on how to recruit for the public sector workforce? How do we actually get those best people per the two of your points?
Got to raise the wages and got to make it easier to hire them. So it's, we used to be able to hire people in public sector jobs because they had the big pensions. Now often the pensions are cut. They have lower wages and they don't get the pension. And it just makes it really, really hard to compete. And you just got to raise the wages. Like, look, people are, to a large extent, rational economic actors. You're not going to be able to recruit them unless you have good wages. One. Two, it is often the case, Jen's alluded to this, it's really hard to hire people. Like the process could take so many months. So like, if you do finally get someone who's willing to take a pay cut out of an interest in public service or something else, like often you're going to lose them over the course of months that they have, the hoops they have to go through before you can actually get approved for the job. So like, we shouldn't do that. And like those hoops have good reasons. A lot of these things are well-intentioned. Maybe most of them, probably almost most of these things are well-intentioned. But you got to look at the system as a whole and realize it's broken and be willing to change it. So that's what I'd say. Easier to hire and raise the wages.
I'd only add that I think hiring is the number one thing, and I think speed is just as important as wages. I would also say that once they get in, if they spend all their time trying to manage out an underperformer, or they feel like they have a fantastic team, but like they can't get rid of this one person, that's really demoralizing, and we need to retain too. And if we're losing people because they're frustrated with the sort of the rest of the civil service system, that's also unacceptable.
So slightly long, good question, but slightly long from Zachary here. So I'll try to cut down reasonably. Is judicial review really adding to the infrastructure project timelines? Bennett and Wilson, 2023, concluded that there is not enough information to answer that question. And Adelman and Glixman looked at the litigation timelines, but not whether injunctions impacted project timelines. My experience in the courts is that courts rarely issue injunctions and project construction proceeds during litigation. So are efforts to address judicial review the best use of resources to achieve state capacity goals? Lawyer Zach will be taking this first.
Yeah. So I think that I to read kind of inside the question, there's a lot of focus on permitting. Like if I had to guess, there were the number one possibility for a bipartisan bill other than appropriations next year, I think it might be permitting. So there is this sense that permitting, and which basically often means the litigation that results from the permitting process, as like the number one problem. And like, I don't know if it's the number one problem. Like Jen and I we've been talking mostly about other things, about personnel, about data, about a whole bunch of other personal issues, tools issues, and procedural issues. Do I think that litigation and permitting are issues? Yes, I do. So the facts are, for environmental reviews, they take 4.5 years on average to do. That's a really long time, and much, much longer than it used to be, even in the mid-90s. In terms of litigation, there's one Adelman paper that did collect data, said that it takes a year and a half of litigation for NEPA. It takes a year and a half litigation if the lawsuit totally fails. If it succeeds, it takes 2.5 years. And like, that's a lot of time. Now, of course, there's often not litigation, but the fact that there's not litigation actually doesn't say all that much. because project planners do a huge amount out of fear of litigation. So you know, the example of a highway, you build up beneath ground, you build sound walls, you sometimes build housing nearby. Like these things may or may not be worth it, but like they often dramatically increase costs, even in the absence of litigation, just with the threat of litigation. So I think it's very much worth the effort. I think that it is exciting to see the effort that's being done for permitting reform on a bipartisan basis. But again, like you said, like it's just one of many issues.
I really don't, I'm not qualified to speak to the specific issue of like NEPA lawsuits, but I will say I think there's a general pattern that I'd pull out from Zach's comments. If you go into an agency and ask like, why are you doing this thing that does not seem necessary and is causing extra time, very often the answer is, well, we once got sued. And so it's not just the lawsuit that happens at that moment, it's the tail of that lawsuit, which I think sometimes must be just like decades, like they like the lore then that persists, that we once got sued for this thing, so we must do this crazy thing, seems to like never die.
Well, those environmental impact statements that are 4 times as long as they were in the late 70s. We don't know exactly why, but one theory of what's going on is exactly what Jen says, is that you get sued once on issue X, then issue X is in. You get sued on issue Y, and then issue Y is in forever. Then you get sued on issue Z, and issue Z is in forever. And that's how this get longer and longer over time.
And you can say it's the fault of the people who sue, or you can say it's the fault of the people who overreact inside government, and both are true.
Next question in the news you can use category. Jen, I work in the Ontario provincial government, and as you will expect, we have many of the same problems. Are there any organizations you know of in Canada that are pulling in the same direction or that Canadians should know about or look into?
The organizations I know in Canada sort of come from my roots, so they're working on the digital side of it, like Code for Canada. There's a wonderful conference called Forward 50, and I think they get at state capacity from a sort of digital transformation perspective, but I don't know any that are specifically working on Canadian state capacity.
Big opportunity for folks looking to form new organizations on this call. Next question. The topic of firing was touched on, but I'm curious, what would your advice be on firing effectively in a way that doesn't just end up inadvertently cutting top performers or lead to them leaving, and figuring out who to quit, figuring out who to cut quickly?
You want to take that, Zach, or?
Yeah, I'll mostly leave it to you. I have firing, like the details of this is not something that I've thought about deeply. As Jen said, this is one of the kind of things that impacts all areas of state capacity. Is not really an infrastructure specific issue. Specifically, one thing I do want to say though is relates to DOGE, which is that like the civil service in the U.S. like look has a lot of people aren't very good, but like overall like it's pretty great, and it would be a real shame if you know, we nuked civil service protections in a way that led good people to leave. So this has come up with Schedule F. Trump has suggested that for the top 40,000 or so civil servants, we're going to remove their civil service protections, and thus they'd be able to be removed from their jobs. Like, yes, maybe you remove some bad actors, but what you also might do is a lot of people who are very good are going to leave because they don't want their jobs politicized. Their job security is very valuable to them. That's one way in which you can pay them less. They value that job security. So we're able to get people, the government's able to get people at lower rates because of that job security. All that said, like, look, it's too hard to fire people within the federal government and state and local governments. And I hope Jen has great ideas on how to solve that specifically.
I completely agree. I think the vast majority of civil servants are not just great, but like actually heroes because they get stuff done within a frankly much harder environment than folks in the private sector. Um, and I'll also echo that, yeah, Schedule F, I think, sort of looms over every discussion of hiring, firing, performance management in government. And the thing that I cannot be clearer about is that Schedule F is not civil service reform. Civil service reform is getting the merit system principles on which the civil service is meant to be based to actually be operationalized. Schedule F says this: we're not going to fire people because they're not doing their job. We're going to reclassify folks so that we can fire them arbitrarily. There's nothing in Schedule F about showing that the person isn't performing. It's just essentially putting them in the category of political appointee, and the political appointees are who you swap in and out when there's a new administration because you want your own people there. So I've been told that this isn't not quite fair, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's a loyalty test, right? Like, or certainly, let me say, could be used as a loyalty test, which is very different from creating a new operationalized system that actually gets you the outcomes that the merit system principles intended. And I think that's what we really need to do. I think that's going to involve a lot of sort of tearing down the sort of affordances and processes and procedures that have been built on the merit system principles and sort of bringing it back to the foundation. But I think it's very, very important that we maintain that foundation of the merit system.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes, so I just wanted to pull out. Apologies that not being able to cover every single person's questions. They're all great, and I think shows to the real interest here. I just want to pull out this quick last question, cutting a bit of the opening though. A lot of the complexity we're discussing in this conversation today has to do with addressing issues raised by a multitude of stakeholders, including the public. Any suggestions on how we can streamline these processes without causing more problems? I think that's a great closing question for us today.
Yeah, I differ from a lot of people who have thought about reforming permitting, and that, I think we want actually more public participation and not less. And I think we can do it. So the premise, part of the premise behind the National Environmental Policy Act, but part of it was to protect the environment. Why the environment's in the name. But part of it was also to have more public participation. There's not much evidence that's actually working all that well. It allows NIMBYs to hold things up. One notable finding from my paper on the cost of the highways is that after NEPA passed, the folks who got more expensive highways were only in rich areas. The poor areas didn't actually seem to be able to benefit from NEPA, or at least the rich areas benefited a heck of a lot more. So how do you do it? I think what we should do is look to what other countries do, and they do not use procedures in judicial review to enforce, at least not to the extent we do, to enforce participation. They rely on two things. They rely on politics. Politicians have an incentive to listen to the public. And two, they rely on bureaucratic practice. As a theme that Jen and I have been talking about, so that bureaucrats, civil servants, I don't mean to be derisive, civil servants, they tend to follow the rules. Sometimes that's bad, but sometimes that's good. So if the procedure is you listen to the public, even if it's not because you are threatened by lawsuits, then that's a really good thing. So I would depend upon a civil service that has rules to listen, and that sincerely tries to, and I try to listen early, and I would not do it in the defensive, often, cover your ass way that environmental review causes it. I do it in a sincere way that it actually involves true listening, which is often the case now because politicians have the incentives to do that. But I think that there's significant scope to improve by having less because of fear of litigation and more because of because it's part of normal practice.
Nothing to add.
Great. So that's a perfect place. And from the chat, folks will see that the paper is now linked on the event webpage. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is, once again, sorry we couldn't answer all the questions, but indication there's more work to be done. Zach, Jen, thank you for joining us for this great webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks. Love talking to you both.